Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Thanks to our listeners in Germany, Guatemala, and the USA. It's episode 38. Let's get into it.
This week, we've got a trading restriction that shaped retail markets for 25 years and then disappeared with almost no public ceremony. A mosquito control strategy that sounds like science fiction until you realize it is just biology, logistics, and a lot of sterile insects. A long-wave BBC signal going silent after nearly a century, and a World Cup audience choosing a YouTube creator layer over the broadcast logic sports executives grew up with. In Wake Up Ready, we walk through the week ahead. Humor Me has an internet founder charging people money for literally no reason, and somehow creating one of the cleanest business models on the internet. The Greater Debate puts Thomas Hobbes and Rosa Parks on a city bus with facial recognition cameras and asks whether public safety becomes something different when the price of riding is your face. And in Let's Invent Again, we meet David Walt, who helped change genomics by watching tiny beads fall into tiny holes and deciding not to ignore what he saw.
Overlook, discover, reconcile.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Start here. There is an organ sitting in your chest right now that almost nobody talks about after childhood. It's called the thymus. For most of modern medicine, the thymus had a strange reputation. It mattered when you were young because it helped train T cells, the immune system's search and destroy teams. Then, as you aged, it shrank. It got fatty. It seemed to fade. So the adult thymus became one of those biological structures that doctors knew about but rarely treated as clinically central. New research says that may have been a very expensive mistake. Researchers at Mass General Brigham and collaborators used deep learning to analyze routine CT scans from more than 25,000 adults in a lung cancer screening cohort, plus more than 2,500 people in the Framingham Heart Study. The AI did not need a new scan. It used images that already existed. It looked at the size, shape, and composition of the thymus and generated a thymic health score. And the signal was not subtle. Adults with higher thymic health scores had about a 50% lower risk of dying from any cause, a 63% lower risk of cardiovascular death, and a 36% lower risk of developing lung cancer compared with people whose thymic scores were low. In a separate cancer immunotherapy analysis, stronger thymic health was associated with lower risks of cancer progression and death. Now, important caveat, this is not yet a consumer test you should go demand from your doctor on Monday. The researchers themselves say the method needs more validation before routine clinical use, but as a signal, it is powerful. The point is not just the thymus matters. The point is that the evidence was sitting inside ordinary clinical images, not in a secret database, not in a billion-dollar new instrument, in scans patients were already getting.
The organ that trained your immune system got declared retired, and then the data said, actually, he's still on payroll.
Exactly. That same pattern shows up in markets. For 25 years, a single rule shaped what small retail traders could and could not do. If you had less than $25,000 in a margin account, you were restricted from making more than 3-day trades in a rolling 5-business-day period. It was called the pattern day trader rule. It came out of the dot-com era. The justification was protection. Small accounts, fast trading, too much risk. On June 4th, 2026, that structure changed. FINRA's amended Rule 4210 took effect, replacing the old day trading framework with a more general intraday margin standard. The pattern day trader concepts are removed from the rule. The $25,000 PDT equity requirement goes away. Brokers still have to monitor margin risk. Customers still need sufficient collateral. This is not free leverage forever. But the old Brightline wealth gate is gone. That matters because the old rule had a very strange moral logic. If you had $24,000, the system told you you needed protection from yourself. If you had $26,000, congratulations, you were now financially wise enough to click buttons more often.
A $2,000 difference between reckless gambler and market participant.
The rule may have reduced some reckless trading, but it also treated wealth as a proxy for sophistication, which is not the same thing. A person with a smaller account could be disciplined. A person with a larger account could be a menace with a candlestick chart. The old system did not actually measure judgment. It measured account size. The downstream effects will take time. Some brokers will implement faster than others. Some will still add their own risk controls. And plenty of people will discover that being allowed to trade more often is not the same thing as being good at trading. But structurally, this is a major retail market change hiding in an administrative update. It changes intraday behavior. It changes education and risk management for small accounts. It changes the brokerage product surface. And it may increase attention on small cap names where a regulatory filing, certification, or contract rumor can move faster than institutional research. The $25,000 gate did not fall with a speech. It fell with a rule notice. Now let's go from market structure to mosquitoes. France is deploying a mosquito army, not to bite people, to fail romantically. A French startup called Terratis, based in Montpellier, is producing roughly 1.5 million sterile male tiger mosquitoes every week. The process is simple in concept and hard in execution. Breed the mosquitoes, separate the males from the females, sterilize the males using controlled radiation, then release them into neighborhoods. The males do not bite. They mate with wild females. The eggs do not hatch. This is the sterile insect technique. It is not new as an idea, but what is changing is the operating environment. Tiger mosquitoes are no longer a distant tropical nuisance. They can transmit dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. And as temperatures shift, they have expanded deeper into southern Europe. Local health authorities have been dealing with a species that is invasive, resilient, and increasingly comfortable in places that did not used to think of mosquito-borne disease as a serious local problem. Terratis is trying to turn biocontrol from a clever pilot into a scalable service. The company plans to increase production dramatically over the next couple of years. If that works, you are not just watching a public health experiment. You are watching a possible new operating model for pest control. Less chemical spray, more biological logistics.
It is pest control as a supply chain. The product is a mosquito whose business model is reproductive disappointment.
That is the cleanest version. And the second-order question is bigger than one French city. If climate change pushes disease vectors into wealthier temperate regions, the market for mosquito control changes. If pesticide resistance keeps rising, the toolkit has to change. And if non-GMO sterile insect release works at commercial scale, then agriculture, public health, and municipal services all get a new option. The mosquito was already there. The disease risk was already there. The new thing is that Europe is starting to treat it like infrastructure. Now to Vietnam, where the story is not hidden in data or biology, it is hidden in the ground. In Hưng Yên province, outside Hanoi, a Trump-branded golf and residential project has triggered intense controversy over land, graves, compensation, and diplomacy. The development has been reported as a roughly $1.5 billion project involving the Trump Organization brand and local Vietnamese partners. It covers a large agricultural area. And for some families, the land being cleared is not just farmland. It includes ancestral graves. That detail matters. In Vietnamese culture, ancestral graves are not just historical markers. They are part of family duty, memory, spiritual continuity, and respect for the dead. Moving a grave is not like moving a fence. It is an emotional and cultural rupture. Reports from the site describe families exhuming remains, marking graves, and wrestling with compensation that many residents say does not reflect the true loss of livelihood or memory. There is a temptation from a distance to file this under development dispute. But that phrase is too clean. This is what development looks like when it lands on people who experience the land as biography. A government may see investment. A developer may see a resort. A local family may see the place where grandparents and children are buried.
One economy is pricing the land by the square meter. The other is pricing it by the ancestor.
Yes, and the geopolitical layer makes it sharper. Vietnam has been navigating trade pressure, foreign investment, and its relationship with Washington. A luxury project tied to a sitting American president's family brand does not arrive in a neutral diplomatic vacuum. The core question is not whether Vietnam should build resorts or whether foreign investment is bad or whether all infrastructure conflict can be avoided. The question is who pays the hidden price when global capital, national diplomacy, and local memory all point at the same field. The resort is new. The graves were already there. 2 days ago, Venezuela was hit by major earthquakes in the north of the country. The reported magnitudes were severe, the damage is still being assessed, and the casualty figures have been moving as rescuers reach more areas. Early official numbers were lower. Later reports and modeling suggested the toll could climb sharply. That uncertainty is part of the story. In the first days after a major earthquake, the true damage is often invisible because the places most affected are also the hardest to count. But Venezuela's case is especially fragile because the earthquake did not hit a healthy system. It hit a country already weakened by years of economic collapse, infrastructure decay, migration, underfunded services, and political dysfunction. Hospitals were strained before the shaking started. Power and water systems were vulnerable before buildings cracked. Emergency response capacity was limited before the first rescue team reached the rubble. This is the part of disaster analysis that does not fit neatly into the magnitude number. A 7-point-something earthquake is a geological event. The disaster is what happens when that event meets buildings, roads, hospitals, politics, money, and trust.
The earthquake is the shock, the damage is the balance sheet.
Exactly. And for Venezuela, the balance sheet was already impaired. That creates 3 downstream concerns. First, humanitarian response. Search and rescue, trauma care, shelter, clean water, and logistics all matter immediately. Second, migration. If already vulnerable households lose homes, jobs, or access to basic services, regional migration pressure can rise. Third, energy. Venezuela's oil production is much smaller than it once was, but in a year where global energy markets are already sensitive to Hormuz disruption, every supply risk gets attention. So when you see earthquake coverage, do not only ask, what was the magnitude? Ask, what system did it hit? The fault line was geological. The vulnerability was already there. On June 3rd, the European Commission made a very blunt argument about technology dependence. The basic message was, Europe does not want critical digital infrastructure that someone else can switch off. That is the logic behind the EU's new tech sovereignty push, a package centered on cloud, AI, semiconductors, and strategic infrastructure. The proposals include a Cloud and AI Development Act and a CHIPS Act 2.0. The goal is to reduce dependence on foreign providers, especially in sensitive sectors, and build more European capacity in cloud services, data centers, AI infrastructure, and semiconductor production. The political phrase that cut through was the idea of a kill switch. Europe is looking at cloud dependence, foreign legal reach, chip supply chains, export controls, and geopolitical coercion, and asking a very direct question. If our hospitals, banks, border systems, energy grids, and public agencies run on someone else's digital stack, how sovereign are we?
Cloud sovereignty sounds like a conference panel until someone asks who can turn your lights off.
That's the point. This is not just Brussels trying to make another compliance framework. It is Europe reacting to a world where technology supply chains are now openly geopolitical. The US, China, and Europe are all learning that software, cloud access, chips, and AI models are not just economic assets, they are instruments of power. For US tech companies, the package is not necessarily an immediate revenue cliff. The proposals still need political negotiation. European alternatives will not appear overnight, and US hyperscalers are already creating localized, sovereign cloud offerings to adapt. But the direction of travel is clear. Procurement will become more political. Data residency will not be enough by itself. Ownership, legal compulsion, operational control, and supply chain exposure will all matter more. The old assumption was use the best global technology provider and optimize for cost, performance, and reliability. The new assumption is ask who controls the dependency when the relationship gets hostile. The dependency was already there. Europe is just naming it out loud. Now to the Pentagon, where the rules are trying to catch up to the weapons. On June 5th, the White House issued National Security Presidential Memorandum 11, directing the national security enterprise to accelerate the adoption of artificial intelligence. One part of that memorandum directs the Defense Department to update the policy governing autonomy in weapons systems within 90 days. That policy, DoD Directive 3000.09, is one of the central documents governing how the U.S. thinks about autonomous weapons. The question is not whether drones, sensors, algorithms, and AI-enabled targeting exist. They already do. The question is how much human judgment is required, where in the chain it sits, and who is accountable when a system makes or accelerates a lethal decision. At the same time, funding attention around autonomous systems is exploding. The Defense Autonomous Warfare Group, DAWG, has been tied to a proposed massive increase in fiscal year funding. Congressional concern is rising too. Senator Ruben Gallego pressed the Pentagon on the risks of rushing changes to autonomous weapons policy. Senator Mark Kelly has pushed language around human responsibility in the use of force. This is the doctrine gap becoming visible.
The machines move faster than the rule book. Now the rule book is sprinting in combat boots.
And that should make everyone slow down enough to think clearly. The strongest case for acceleration is real. Adversaries are building and deploying autonomous systems. Ukraine, Iran, the Red Sea, and drone-saturated battlefields have all shown that cheap, fast, networked systems can change the economics of conflict. The U.S. military cannot pretend the technology is theoretical. But the strongest concern is also real. Human in the loop can mean many things. A human who designs the mission is not the same as a human who approves a target. A human who supervises a swarm is not the same as a human who meaningfully understands every engagement. And once speed becomes the strategic advantage, human deliberation can start to look like friction. That is the uncomfortable part. In warfare, what gets called friction is often also what we call judgment. The autonomous system was already on the battlefield. The policy fight is whether the human stays there too. Here is one that happened today and is small enough that most people missed it. BBC Radio 4 longwave went silent. The 198 kHz longwave service ended on June 27th, bringing down the curtain on a broadcast lineage reaching back through nearly a century of British longwave radio. The reasons are practical: aging transmitters, declining usage, high maintenance costs, and replacement systems that made the old infrastructure harder to justify. Most listeners will be fine. Radio 4 still exists on FM, DAB, BBC Sounds, smart speakers, TV platforms, and the rest of the modern audio stack. For everyday listening, the transition is manageable. But longwave was not only an audio format. It was a kind of fallback architecture. It reached places where other systems were weaker: remote rural areas, ships, older receivers, odd corners of the country where digital infrastructure does not always behave perfectly. It was also connected to other legacy systems, including radio teleswitching used in some electricity meters. That is why the story got attention from resilience people. Not because everyone secretly wants to return to the warm hiss of analog radio, but because old infrastructure often provides backup value that does not show up in normal usage statistics.
The spreadsheet says low listenership. The emergency planner says what happens when the other systems fail.
Correct. Modern infrastructure is efficient because it consolidates. It streams, it routes through software, it cuts redundant systems. Most of the time, that is cheaper and better. But redundancy always looks wasteful until the primary system fails. Longwave radio is a small example of a bigger question. As countries modernize communications, energy, payments, navigation, and emergency services, which analog or legacy systems are quietly providing resilience? And are we retiring them after mapping the gap or before? And finally, the World Cup is showing sports executives something that should no longer be surprising. Owning the game is not the same thing as owning the moment. Brazil's CazéTV, a YouTube native sports channel built around streamer Casemiro Miguel, has been pulling enormous live audiences during the 2026 World Cup. Reports put its peak live viewership above 12 million concurrent viewers for a Brazil match, with later peaks climbing even higher. That is not a highlights clip. That is not somebody reacting after the game. That is live sports consumption happening through a creator-native media layer. CazéTV is not trying to look like traditional broadcast. The tone is conversational. The community is native to the platform. The audience is not just watching the game. It is watching with someone inside a cultural room that feels different from television.
The broadcast says, "Here is the match." The creator says, "Come sit with us."
And that distinction matters because younger audiences increasingly separate the live event from the experience around the live event. The commentary layer, the chat layer, the clipped moments, the memes, the parasocial host relationship, the watch-along feeling. Those are not accessories anymore. They are part of the product. For leagues and rights holders, this changes the map. The old model assumed the rights package was the thing. Buy the rights, sell the ads, control the broadcast. But if creator-led distribution can deliver massive audiences with a different cost structure and a stronger community feel, then creator rights become their own territory. The second-order implication is that sports rights may fragment. One company owns the official broadcast. Another owns creator co-streams. Another owns highlights. Another owns short-form clips. Another owns alternate commentary. The game becomes the center of an attention ecosystem rather than a single TV product. The World Cup did not create that future, it just made it measurable. The audience was already there. CazéTV gave it a room. Now let's wake up ready. There are 5 things worth having on your radar. First, the June Employment Situation Report drops Thursday, July 2nd at 8:30 in the morning Eastern. That is the big one. The market will quote the payroll number first, because the payroll number is the headline. But the more important piece may be average hourly earnings. Under Kevin Warsh, the Fed has been trying to say less and force markets to pay closer attention to the incoming data itself. That makes wage pressure more important, because wage growth is the part of the labor market that can keep service inflation sticky even if hiring slows. If payrolls are strong and wages reaccelerate, the market starts pricing a more hawkish Fed path. If payrolls slow and wage growth cools, the opposite happens. Small-cap consumer names, home builders, and rate-sensitive areas may catch a bid. The clean tell is the 2-year Treasury. It will usually move before the equity market has finished writing the narrative.
Everyone watches the jobs number. The Fed watches the pressure inside the jobs number.
Second, ISM Manufacturing for June drops Wednesday, July 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern. The May ISM Manufacturing reading came in at 54, which was the strongest expansion signal since 2022. The question now is whether that was real demand strength or defensive activity caused by supply chain and energy anxiety. So do not stop at the headline PMI. Watch new orders, inventories, prices paid, and supplier deliveries. New orders tell you whether demand is pulling. Inventories tell you whether companies are building buffers. Prices paid tell you whether the energy and input cost shock is leaking into manufacturing inflation. Supplier deliveries tell you whether disruptions are slowing the system. In this environment, inventory accumulation can look like strength, even when it is actually fear.
A warehouse can be full because business is booming or because everyone is nervous.
Third, Kevin Warsh steps onto the global central bank stage at the European Central Bank's annual forum in Portugal. This is not just another central banker panel. Warsh is still new in the chair. Markets are still trying to understand his reaction function. He has signaled a preference for less forward guidance, less hand-holding, fewer verbal breadcrumbs, more dependence on actual data and market discipline. The watch item is how he talks about energy-driven inflation. If he treats the Hormuz shock and related energy volatility as temporary, markets may stay calm. If he frames it as a structural inflation risk, the front end of the Treasury curve can move fast. The phrase to listen for is not a promise. He probably will not give one. The phrase to listen for is the category temporary disturbance or structural pressure.
When a Fed chair says less, the adjectives do more work.
Fourth, keep watching the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S.-Iran ceasefire process. The MOU and negotiating window mattered because markets started to remove some geopolitical risk premium from oil. But the latest reports of renewed attacks and shipping disruption show the deal is fragile. The market risk is not just whether diplomats keep talking, it is whether shipping lanes keep functioning while they talk. Watch vessel traffic. Watch insurance rates. Watch parliamentary and military signals from Iran. Watch U.S. response language. If the ceasefire process holds and shipping normalizes, oil risk premium can keep bleeding out. If another vessel is hit or traffic freezes again, the market will reprice before the diplomatic language catches up.
The ceasefire is written on paper. The oil market reads the water.
Fifth, Lime's IPO prices June 30th and is expected to begin trading July 1st under the ticker Lime. The company is targeting a valuation around the high $1 billion range and raising roughly $180 million. It operates in more than 200 cities across nearly 30 countries. Revenue grew strongly last year, and losses have narrowed, but the more important point is category signal. Micromobility used to be the punchline of the late 2010s venture cycle. Too many scooters, too much burn, too little discipline. Lime is the survivor. If this IPO prices well and trades up, it says public markets are willing to revisit a category that was once written off, provided the unit economics have improved and the company survived the shakeout. That matters beyond scooters. It tells you something about risk appetite outside the AI center of gravity. My personal watch this week is Hormuz. Not because jobs in ISM do not matter. They do. But the market knows how to process economic data. What it is worse at processing is a fragile geopolitical process where a single drone strike can change shipping behavior, insurance pricing, oil assumptions, inflation expectations, and Fed probabilities in the same afternoon.
And that is how you wake up ready. Here's the knowledge bomb. Housing inflation is one of those economic numbers that sound simple until you realize the government is not exactly measuring what you think it is measuring. When normal people talk about housing costs, they mean rent, mortgage payments, insurance, property taxes, repairs, the mysterious $400 Home Depot run that somehow fixed nothing. But when the inflation report talks about housing, it is mostly measuring shelter. And the biggest piece of shelter is owner's equivalent rent, or OER. That sounds like a fake finance term invented to make apartments more expensive. But here is the plain English version. OER asks homeowners, if you had to rent your own house from yourself, what would that rent be? That is the number. Not your mortgage, not your down payment, not the fact that your insurance company looked at one weather map and added $900 to your life, just the estimated rental value of living in the home you own. And this matters because OER is huge. It is roughly a quarter of the entire CPI basket. Shelter overall is more than a third. So when housing costs move slowly, inflation moves slowly. This is why the Federal Reserve can look at inflation and say we're making progress, while a 24-year-old looking at a one-bedroom listing says progress for who? The raccoons? Here is the latest picture. In May 2026, shelter costs rose 0.3% for the month. Owner's equivalent rent rose 0.3%. Rent of primary residence rose 0.4%. Over the past year, shelter was up about 3.4%. That is cooler than the ugly pandemic-era housing inflation numbers. But it is still rising, just slower. So the headline is housing inflation is cooling. Housing affordability is still annoying. And those are not the same thing. This is the part that trips people up. If your rent went from $1,600 to $2,100 over the last few years, and now it only goes up to $2,140, economists say rent inflation cooled. You say, I still live in the crime scene. Both are true. Inflation measures the speed of the increase. Affordability measures whether the number is insane. Right now, the speed is slowing. The level is still painful. And there's another reason the official housing data feels late. CPI shelter is like the friend who reacts to a meme 3 weeks after everyone else has moved on. Real-time rents, the prices you see on Zillow, Apartment List, or a building's leasing page, tend to move first. These are new leases, new listings, and asking rents. Official CPI shelter moves later because it includes lots of existing tenants whose rents reset slowly. Many leases change once a year. The government sample does not instantly capture every new deal, discount, or concession. So when market rents exploded in 2021 and 2022, CPI shelter took time to catch up. Now the reverse is happening. Market rents have cooled. Some apartment markets are soft. New buildings are offering concessions. You see 1 month free or 6 weeks free because landlords are suddenly discovering humility. But CPI shelter is still catching up on the way down. That means the official inflation number can look stickier than the rental market feels in real time. The vacancy data help explain it. Rental vacancy has moved up from the tightest pandemic-era levels, which gives renters a little more leverage in some markets. But the for-sale housing market is different. There still are not many homes sitting empty and available to buy. So renters are starting to see some supply relief. Buyers are still fighting the boss battle. High mortgage rates, high prices, low inventory, owners locked into old cheap mortgages and refusing to move unless someone pries their 3% rate out of their cold, financially responsible hands. That is why the housing story feels contradictory. Rent growth is cooling, apartment supply is improving, but buying a home still feels like trying to join a country club where the initiation fee is your entire nervous system. So what does the latest OER trend actually mean? It means housing inflation is no longer the runaway engine it was a few years ago. Good. But it also means the official inflation numbers may keep cooling gradually, not dramatically because OER is slow and shelter is huge inside CPI. The big thing to watch is whether softer real-time rents keep feeding into official inflation through late 2026 and into 2027. Here's the clean takeaway. There are 3 housing clocks. The first clock is real-time rent. That one moves first. The second clock is official CPI shelter. That one moves later. The third clock is affordability. That one is still yelling. So when someone says housing inflation is getting better, they may be right. But when someone says housing still feels impossible, they may also be right, because the chart can improve before your life does. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. Capitalism walks into a room, forgets why it came in, and somehow leaves with $5,000. This week's exhibit comes from Hacker News, where someone posted, "Show HN, a site where people pay me money for no reason." That is not a metaphor. That is the product. The website is called payfornoreason.com. The pitch is beautifully simple. You give this person money, and in return, you receive absolutely nothing. No subscription, no premium tier, no community, no AI-powered dashboard, no white paper called the Future of Generosity Infrastructure. Just money leaving your account for no reason. And here is the best part. It worked. The creator says a friend bet him he could not make $1 million from the site by the end of the year. At the time of the post, he was already at $5,010. Which means we have reached a new stage of the internet economy. Not software as a service, not platform as a service, but reason as a service, except the reason has been removed. Honestly, it may be the cleanest business model I have ever seen. Zero inventory, zero fulfillment, zero refunds, zero customer support. The only thing missing is a McKinsey report calling it frictionless monetization of absurdist intent. And the comments were perfect. One person said it reminded them of the $1 million homepage, where people paid to own pixels on a website. And that actually makes sense, because the internet has always had this strange tradition where a joke becomes a business model because enough people collectively decide, you know what? I would like to be part of the bit. That is the key here. People are not really paying for nothing. They are paying to be in on the joke, which, depending on your view of modern finance, is either charming or indistinguishable from several asset classes. A meme coin at least pretends there is a roadmap. This site has the courage to say, there is no road, there is no map, please enter your card number. Apparently, 2 people gave $1,000 each. The creator responded, I don't know what I did to deserve it. That may be the most honest founder update in history. Usually, when someone raises money online, there is a deck, a total addressable market, a mission statement, some line about democratizing access to something nobody asked for. Here, the founder thesis is, I made a button. You clicked it, we are both surprised. Someone asked how people even found the site. The answer was basically, I posted it a few places and got lucky. That is the whole growth strategy. No funnel, no content engine, no paid acquisition, just vibes, screenshots, and the collective internet impulse to say, this is stupid, I support it. Which is also how half of venture capital worked from 2020 to 2021. Then someone asked the obvious question, what are you going to do with the money? And the creator said, buy an apartment. Now suddenly the bit has stakes. Because at first, this is just internet nonsense. But then you realize, in a housing market where young people are priced out, debt is expensive, and affordability is a national crisis, someone looked at all the traditional paths, saving, investing, budgeting, career advancement, and said, what if I simply ask strangers to pay me for no reason? And somehow that may be one of the more efficient housing strategies currently available. It is a 20% down payment, but make it performance art. Of course, not everyone loved it. One commenter pointed out that this is not really for no reason anymore, because now there is a bet involved. People are paying to make the no less certain. Which is fair. Once there is a goal, a scoreboard, and a deadline, it becomes less like charity and more like a prediction market wearing a clown nose. Another commenter even joked about creating a site to bet on whether the site would pay out. And there it is, the derivatives market. First, someone makes money for no reason. Then, people bet on whether he will make more money for no reason. Then someone creates a market on the market. Then a newsletter explains the market. Then a podcast makes fun of the newsletter explaining the market. And now here we are. This is how civilization ends. Not with a bang, but with a striped checkout button labeled because it would be funny. But I will give the project this. It is radically honest. Most of the internet asks you to pay for something that is technically something, but emotionally nothing. A productivity app you abandon in 4 days. A paid community where everyone is promoting their own paid community. a course on building courses, a newsletter about monetizing newsletters. This site skips the ceremony. It says, there's no value proposition. There's no transformation. There's no hidden unlock. You are sending money because the joke improves when the number goes up. And honestly, that is cleaner than a lot of businesses. So congratulations to payfornoreason.com. You have built the purest expression of the modern economy, a product with no product, a reason with no reason, and a founder who is more confused by the revenue than the customers are. And somewhere, a venture capitalist is already whispering, can this scale?
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. The bus has always been more than a bus. It is a box on wheels, sure. Fluorescent lights, vinyl seats, someone eating fries at 8:40 in the morning like civilization has no rules. But the bus is also one of the most important pieces of public infrastructure in America. It is how people get to work when they do not own a car. It is how kids get to school. It is how seniors get to the doctor. It is how a city quietly decides who can move, who can belong, and who has to ask permission. And that is why today's greater debate is not really about cameras. It is about the oldest question in politics. How much freedom do we give up to feel safe? On one side, Thomas Hobbes, philosopher of the Leviathan, the man who looked at human beings and basically said, without a strong sovereign, this whole thing turns into a knife fight at Costco. On the other side, Rosa Parks, whose most famous act of political defiance happened on a bus. Not in a courtroom, not on a battlefield, not in a Senate chamber. On a bus, in the ordinary public space where dignity was being rationed by law. And the issue before them is live facial recognition on city buses. Not sci-fi, not 10 years from now. The kind of thing cities are already debating and piloting. AI-powered cameras on buses that scan riders and compare faces against lists. Banned riders, missing persons, perhaps law enforcement watch lists. Supporters say this protects drivers, passengers, and vulnerable people. Opponents say this turns every bus ride into a biometric checkpoint. So let's begin. Thomas Hobbes walks onto the bus first. He looks at the camera. Because to Hobbes, this is the whole point of government. He says, look, the first job of the state is not to make you feel spiritually unmonitored. The first job of the state is to keep you alive. Before rights are poetry, before privacy is principle, before democracy has a newsletter and a tote bag, there has to be order. A bus driver should not have to be a hostage negotiator. A rider should not have to wonder whether the person stepping on the bus has already been legally banned for attacking transit workers. A missing child should not move through the city invisible to the systems that could find them. To Hobbes, the camera is not tyranny. The camera is the social contract finally getting software updates. His case is simple. If the city owns the bus, funds the bus, staffs the bus, and is responsible when violence happens on the bus, then the city has the authority to secure the bus. And if the bus already has cameras, Hobbes would ask, what exactly is the sacred difference between recording danger after the fact and detecting danger before it happens? He would say we already accept weaker versions of surveillance. CCTV on buses, cameras in stations, license plate readers, fare systems, security patrols. Facial recognition is not a new category of public control, he says. It is a faster tool for a job the public already expects the state to perform. He leans forward. You want public transit to work? Then it must be safe. Because the people most harmed by disorder are not the rich. The rich have garages, the rich have Ubers, the rich have a second car, a private school drop-off lane, and a ring camera watching the ring camera. If the bus becomes unsafe, the poor do not switch to luxury alternatives. They lose mobility. So Hobbes makes the case that facial recognition on buses is not anti-equity. It is pro-public infrastructure. The stronger the public system, the more ordinary people can rely on it. If AI cameras help prevent assaults, identify people banned for violence, locate missing seniors, find abducted children, or keep drivers from being forced into confrontations, then the sovereign is doing exactly what it exists to do. It is keeping the peace. And then Rosa Parks answers. Not loudly, not theatrically. That is the thing about this side of the debate. It does not need theatrical outrage because the stage itself is already loaded. Bus, a public bus. the exact place where the law once said you may ride, but only in your assigned humiliation. Parks looks at Hobbes and says your theory assumes the sovereign is neutral. History says otherwise. Because in 1955 the bus was safe for some people and controlled for others. The law did not merely fail to protect black riders. The law organized their degradation. The state did not show up as chaos prevention. The state showed up as a seating chart. And this is where Parks breaks the debate open. She says, you keep talking about the social contract. But a contract is not legitimate when one side never truly consented. If public systems are built on unequal power, then order can become the polite word for domination. That is the danger of putting facial recognition on buses. Not because every camera is Bull Connor. Not because every transit official is trying to recreate Jim Crow with a software vendor and a procurement memo. The danger is more modern than that. The danger is that an unequal system can now scale itself. The old bus system needed drivers, signs, police officers, local customs, and explicit rules to decide who was out of place. The new system needs cameras, watch lists, databases, retention policies, and an algorithm that says, match. That is the phrase Parks forces us to sit with. Automated systems do not have to announce their bias. The law does not have to say, sit in the back for a system to quietly learn who gets watched more, flagged more, questioned more, delayed more, misidentified more, and told in 1,000 invisible ways that public space is conditional. Hobbes says the camera ensures you arrive safely. Parks says the camera may ensure the state decides who is allowed to travel at all. And now we have the real debate. Hobbes is not wrong to care about safety. That is what makes this hard. Transit workers are assaulted. Riders do experience violence. Public spaces need protection. A missing child found because a camera recognized them is not a civil liberties abstraction. That is someone's family getting a miracle. Hobbes' strongest argument is that public order is not the enemy of freedom. It is the precondition for it. A bus system that people are afraid to use is not free. A driver who cannot safely do the job is not free. A city that lets public infrastructure decay into fear has not protected liberty. It has privatized liberty for the people who can afford alternatives. But Parks' strongest argument is that safety is often the reason given right before power expands. The watch list starts narrow. Violent trespass bans, missing persons, active threats. Then comes fare evasion, then unpaid fines, then protest activity near transit hubs, then persons of interest. Then a vague category no one can define, but everyone is told not to worry about because technically the data is governed by policy. And policy is a wonderful word. It sounds like law, but often behaves like a PDF. Parks would say, do not ask only what the system is for on launch day. Ask what the system can become once the cameras are installed, the vendor is embedded, the database is connected, and the public has gotten used to being scanned. Because surveillance infrastructure rarely shrinks. It gets normalized. Once the bus becomes a rolling identity checkpoint, anonymity stops being a default condition of public life and becomes a privilege you have to justify. This is the heart of the debate. Hobbes thinks anonymity is dangerous because it lets threats hide. Parks thinks forced visibility is dangerous because it lets power hunt. Hobbes says if you have nothing to hide, the camera is only a guardian. Parks says people said that when the FBI kept files on civil rights leaders. Hobbes says the sovereign must be able to see threats before they become violence. Parks says an unjust sovereign defines dissent as a threat. Hobbes says, but surely we can create rules. Narrow lists, short retention periods, independent audits, human review. Parks says rules matter, but rules did not save the riders in Montgomery. The rules were the problem. Now the room holds. And the practical synthesis is not ban everything or scan everyone. It is do not let the safety argument skip the power analysis. If a city wants facial recognition on buses, the burden should not be on riders to prove why they deserve privacy. The burden should be on the city to prove why identity screening is necessary, why less invasive tools are insufficient, and why the system cannot expand without democratic approval. The default should be public transit is a public good, not a rolling police lineup. What would a serious standard look like? No general law enforcement dragnet. If the stated purpose is transit safety, the list should be transit specific and tightly defined. No secret watch lists. The public should know what categories qualify, who approves them, and how someone challenges being on one. No automatic enforcement. A machine match is a lead, not an identity, and it requires human confirmation. No indefinite retention. If there is no match, biometric templates disappear immediately. And publish the numbers. How many scans, how many matches, how many false positives, by what demographic pattern, with what outcome. Hobbes would hate parts of this. He would say, "You are tying the sovereign's hands. You are forcing the state to file paperwork while threats move freely." Parks would answer, "Yes, that is what rights do. They slow power down. That is the whole point. A free society is not one where the government never acts. A free society is one where the government has to explain itself before it acts on your body, your movement, your identity, your face." And that brings us back to the bus. The bus is where theory becomes physical, where Hobbes's fear of disorder meets Parks's memory of lawful oppression, where public safety and public dignity are not opposites, but they are not automatically allies either. Hobbes was asking, how does the sovereign see threats clearly enough to prevent harm? Parks was asking, who does the sovereign see as the threat? Those are not the same question. And when the price of riding the bus is surrendering your face to a database, we should at least be honest about what has changed. The fare is no longer just money. The fare is identity. And Rosa Parks would remind us, a society reveals itself by who it makes pay extra just to sit down. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. The problem in the early 1990s was scale. Researchers understood that disease lived in the genome, that the instructions for cancer, heart disease, immune dysfunction, and inherited risk were written somewhere in the DNA of every cell. They understood this theoretically. The bottleneck was operational. Sequencing a single gene was a multi-day lab procedure. Analyzing genetic variation across thousands of genes simultaneously was not just expensive. It effectively was not possible at the scale scientists needed. The knowledge existed. The tool to act on it did not. The person was David Walt. Born in 1953, a chemistry professor at Tufts University, later associated with Harvard Medical School and the Wyss Institute, trained in chemical biology, and a man whose instinct began with looking closely at small things. He once described growing up embedded in nature, carrying a magnifying glass, exploring details other people walked past. That habit followed him into the lab. The invention began with an accident. An etching procedure, something that was supposed to do something else, produced an unexpected result on the end of an optical fiber. Tiny wells, evenly spaced, highly reproducible, predictable in depth and diameter, and orders of magnitude smaller than anything previously reported in the field. A fiber with a diameter of roughly 0.5 millimeter could hold tens of thousands of wells. Walt looked closely. Then he added beads. Tiny beads suspended in liquid. He watched them settle. One bead fell into one well, then another, then another. He attached fluorescent dyes to the beads so they could be identified. Each dye encoded identity. Each bead had a location in the array. What he had built was a self-assembled random bead array. It did not require heroic manufacturing precision. A revolution built on watching something fall into a hole. In 1998, Walt co-founded Illumina around bead array technology. Illumina helped push next-generation genotyping and sequencing into a scale and price range that changed biology. Later, Walt co-founded Quanterix, applying similar sensitivity logic to single-molecule protein detection, finding biomarkers at concentrations far below what older methods could reliably measure. The unexpected consequence arrived gradually, then everywhere. The Human Genome Project cost billions of dollars and took more than a decade. Today, sequencing a human genome can cost a few $100s and take days. That economic shift did not just change research labs. It changed what medicine can ask. Can we estimate genetic risk before symptoms? Can oncologists match therapies to tumor biology? Can liquid biopsies detect cancer DNA circulating in blood before a tumor becomes visible? Can researchers study disease at population scale instead of one painstaking marker at a time? All of that runs on infrastructure built by people who made biology readable at scale. And the poetic part is that one of the key insights did not arrive as a grand theory. It arrived as a weird pattern on the end of an optical fiber. Tiny wells, tiny beads. A scientist who had spent his life looking closely at small things. The wells were already there. David Walt just did not look away. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc, from a forgotten organ in your chest to beads falling into tiny holes in a fiber from a staple that flows like liquid to a BBC signal that went silent after generations. The pattern was simple: overlook, discover, reckon. First principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Till next time, stay curious
Stay kind.
and keep compounding.